morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us and welcome to our webinar. This webinar will be in relation to the Microsoft PowerApps security flaw, which the UpGuard team found. And don't forget that we do have a Q&A function in the webinar, so please do use that if you do have any questions during the webinar, and we will address them when we can. All right, so we'll do some quick intros of ourselves. I can intro Greg first. So Greg Pollock is the VP of Cyber Research for UpGuard, and in his role at UpGuard, Greg oversees the execution of the cyber research product, managing the strategy, roadmap, and the team dedicated to the success of this product. Greg has worked in product management roles at a variety of technology companies, including Gaia Interactive, Schmoop, managing teams responsible for communicating clear requirements to design, engineering, and marketing for the successful execution of product development. So welcome, Greg.
Yeah, thanks, Tulin. And yeah, it's my pleasure to be here with Tulin Sevgin, our Director of Third-Party Risk Management. She works with our customers to assess their third parties for risk and manage that whole process through the UpGuard product. And she's worked places like Commonwealth Bank, Westpac, and other large companies in a variety of IT risk management roles. So yeah, great to be here with you.
Cool, thanks, Greg. All right. So I'll briefly just introduce a rough agenda for us. So basically, we'll be going through the Microsoft PowerApps, giving some background, talking about the leak, what the team found, some of the causes and the impacts, and what companies and individuals can do to help protect themselves from these kind of issues that do come up. All right. Greg, would you be able to give us like a quick kind of brief overview of what happened?
Yeah, I mean, so the high level summary of what we found were one of our analysts, Justin Lloyd, discovered an instance of a PowerApps portal where the OData APIs were publicly accessible. And this led to the question of, are there other portals configured in this way? How widespread is this problem? And what kind of data may be exposed through it? Those are the kinds of questions we always ask, because there are many ways in which products can be configured/misconfigured to make data public, but it may simply be so rare that people expose sensitive information that you've misconfigured some storage, but all you have in it are marketing assets. And so those are the kinds of questions we ask when we discover a way in which data can be made public that seems a little bit suspicious to us. And so we went through this. Yeah, I mean, so like we look through like misconfigured WordPress instances, for example, that allow a listing of directories. And most of what you find in there are just their web assets. So those are the kinds of questions we ask when we find stuff like this. So then we went through this process of like, how can we find portals? In this case, it's really straightforward because the portals are supposed to be public websites. So it's pretty easy, and they have like named subdomains. So through subdomain enumeration or just using search engines, you can find the portals. And then the URL for the OData API is just /_OData, and then that lists any collections. So yeah, we went through this process of finding portals and then seeing which ones have OData enabled and then which ones allow anonymous access to the list entities. And what we found were a fair few of these portals configured that way. And then we looked through those, and then there were thousands of the collections, I'd say hundreds of entities, and then some of them were non-sensitive data, but there were 47 or so that we wound up notifying, saying, hey, there's enough sensitive data here, we think you should have a look at it. And then the data included all kinds of stuff that varied by what the portal was set up to do.
Yeah, right. So when you mention like misconfiguration is what led to this issue in the first place, in your opinion, like what types of information should be public versus private? So not shown to the public in this situation when you're using Microsoft PowerApps.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so for this specific type of product, portals are a really good way to stand up a website that has some business logic, and especially the form capability to intake data and then do some processes on it. And some of the data that was public that we thought was probably correctly configured as such or like product catalogs where it's your product, its price, that's going to go on a website. It may make sense if you're the seller or the producer of the product. You have one database, and then all the marketplaces that sell it can then pull from it anonymously. That said, I do think I think the friction caused by having some authorization for those sellers is probably still worth it. I'm not sure we ever really need anonymous access to data.
Yeah. Great. Okay, cool. So before moving to the next slide, this was quite a large find for the team at UpGuard. And I think it's important to kind of mention and talk about the difference between a data breach versus a data leak. So would you be able to briefly kind of just fill us in on the differences between those two?
Yeah, of course. Data breaches are I think, top of mind threat to defend against, which are some malicious actor trying to break into your systems and steal data, or otherwise, compromise the integrity or availability of it. There's
and it's usually with malicious intent, right? When it's a data breach.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So someone's trying to break in, to do something that you don't want them to do. It's hard to think of an example where you would break in for innocuous reasons. I guess if you work for the government, but that's not.
Or if you're in a social engineering type of role, so I guess.
You're a pen tester, you're supposed to be doing it.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think we're all very familiar with data breaches have been a huge problem now and continue to be so. And we actually have been getting better telemetry into the methods of ransomware gangs, for example. There've been they recently published a handbook that they use. And so we know exactly what kinds of systems, what kinds of companies they're looking for, and you can mold your defense sort of in response to that. Data leaks, on the other hand, the one that we're talking about are when there are lots of people handling data. Data is in many different systems, and then through a non-malicious mistake, someone configures it so that data that should be private is no longer private. And there are many ways that can happen. It can be, in this case, through the configuration of a system, like the PowerApps portal. It could be through the configuration of a database storage, other storage devices, cloud storage, and then SaaS apps, all kinds of ways in which people can make a mistake. And so there's no immediate, evidence of abuse, whereas with the data breach, of course, it's malicious. But part of the economy of data breaches are acquiring initial access. And this is something you've also probably heard about if you follow security news. There's a big market for buying credentials to get into systems. Now, where is that initial access being gained from? That's the part that is more of a mystery. My guess would be, based on how many credentials I've seen exposed through data leaks, that there are some more sophisticated actors who are probably taking advantage of those.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, that's a good point. All right, let's move on. So can you provide us with a little bit more technical information about how these types of data leaks can happen?
Yeah, in some ways, these data leak misconfigurations are always sort of surprisingly simple. And in this case, what happens is that there are two features, or basically two things you need to turn on to make OData APIs private in PowerApps portals. So if you want to enable, OData is like an open data specification. It's just a nicely structured API. And so if you collect data into a portal and then want to use it elsewhere, it's a good feature to enable that and then be able to retrieve that data according to a standard. However, and I think in prior versions of portals and Microsoft CRM, then there was a fair presumption that this data would be exposed to a web page, in which case, if you have authorization mechanisms around that web page, then the data itself would not be accessible. However, in the version we're talking about, then the APIs themselves are directly addressable, whether or not they're being used in any web page. And so if you turn on OData APIs and do not enable table permissions for the table where the data is coming from, then that API is public by default. So in some ways it's kind of very simple. It's just you need, and it's even in the UI. It's not like it's not like I need to tell you where the config file is. It really is, you need to click two things. to make it private. But if it's very easy to turn on the OData feed without turning on the table permissions.
Right.
And that's kind of, yeah, that's kind of all there is to the issue. So that if you have access to your maker portal, then you can go check these configurations. And there are also like other ways, I think we'll talk about that. You can audit yourself for them.
Yeah. So would you say then this is more of a configuration setting issue that's not really highlighted appropriately in like product documentation versus being like a security flaw or an issue that was overlooked during the design phase?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting case to think about how those ideas work together. Yeah, because when we notified Microsoft through their vulnerability program, they said it's a user configuration issue, which is true. But part of what we were saying is that it's a systemic configuration issue, which I would then call a design issue. And yeah, like, I mean, I'm as guilty as anyone of not reading all the documentation, especially it's like, cool, I want to make this thing work.
Yeah, exactly.
And yeah, there are lots of things that have been, I know, yeah, I'll often be blocked by something and then ask one of my team members how to fix it. And they say, yeah, the documentation's right here. It's very easy to overlook, sound advice. And yeah, and that's where I think it comes in to be the responsibility of platform operators to observe how people are using it, to be able to introspect what data is public. Yeah, rather than leaving that to your end users.
Yeah. So would you say then maybe security by design was kind of like overlooked by Microsoft when it comes to this configuration?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I do think so. That yeah, I mean, it's the thing where like I think you can reasonably play out the scenario where people misconfigure this, especially because anything that's sort of public by default is going to be an issue. Actually, I mean, like GitHub is another source of data leaks. GitHub has made the change so that private, you can make repos private. They're still public by default, but it's free for users to make private repos. So that, just lowering the barrier to entry or lowering the hurdles to making data private is I think it's a trend we see in all products that handle anything significant. And then in this case, what Microsoft has done is make it private by default, which is the best case.
Yeah, right. Great. And do you think then being able to know about this configuration setting so that, you don't make certain information public that shouldn't be, do you think that could have been something that would have been picked up in like a third-party risk management analysis? So when you're reviewing and analyzing your third party before you start using the product?
Yeah, I think this is a tough one because we talk to a lot of US government cloud customers who all their apps go through a security review, and they were surprised, like they didn't intend to be exposing this data with like lots of experienced people looking at it. I think it's tough. I think there are, in vulnerability management, we have 0 days that no one knows about until we know about it. I think we have the same thing with the sprawling landscape of apps, where I think there may just be issues that no one knows to check for until someone looks at it the right way and realizes it could be a security issue.
Yeah, right. So now that we've discussed how it happened and the cause of it, I guess the main thing here is now, am I affected by this? How do people know if they're affected by it, I guess, individually? And how would they know if they were working in a company? Like, how would they know if they were affected by this issue?
Yeah, this is like by far the number one question we got. And we tried to address it in our report, and but it's like the burning question is, do I have this problem? And there are a number of, I think, like, there's quite a bit of good news here, where PowerApps portals are a relatively young product. They've been around for a few years. I think I think they're not like millions of these things. I think we're able to pretty effectively canvas the space of them, given that they're supposed to be public. So we did our best to notify the sensitive exposures. I know that Microsoft notified their government cloud customers. I've seen reports that they've notified other people who have public data to review it. Microsoft has updated their portal checker to include checks for this. So even if you don't go into the UI and you're not confident that you found the right place to check it, you can use their tool. And then ultimately, Microsoft has updated the portal's product to have the table permissions enabled by default. So actually the way Microsoft writes about it is really, really good. They say, hey, you may still want to disable this for testing, for dev. There's still times when you would want to put it in, free-for-all mode. But if you do that, please only do it for dev and test, and don't put any sensitive data in there, and then re-enable those permissions for production. So I think, there are still lots of problems that we find where people misconfigure the difference between non-prod environments and prod environments. So it may happen in the future, but I think it's far less likely to. And there are a number of resources you can use to audit yourself if you are not certain whether you were notified.
Yeah. And in your opinion, if someone came across this information and had malicious intent, what could they do with the information that we found?
Yeah, I mean, they probably would have tried to sell it on a dark market, because we see data very similar to these data sets for sale on the dark markets all the time. Yeah. And in fact, we had to check. There was one one large data set of COVID testing related data that we had to verify it was not something that we had detected as a leak. But it was ironically just very similar data, just hackers getting it in different ways than what's being leaked here. But I mean, we know that ransomware groups target high revenue US based companies, which would have been this is what they would be looking for. But in conversation with many of these groups and then cross-referencing what we've seen for sale, it does seem that ransomware groups are operating in a different way. They're looking for creds to RDP servers, and then they have a playbook they run from there, rather than doing so it's the kind of data they would certainly put up for sale, but there's no evidence of that right now.
Yeah. Okay, that's good to hear. So essentially it could lead to identity theft. And so if we hadn't found this leak, if we didn't come across it, how severe could it have gotten to this point? So you said, you'd be able to potentially find it for sale on the dark web, but what other impacts could there have been to businesses and individuals?
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it, that identity theft is the end crime.
Yeah.
And I mean, there were quite a few numbers that have every indication of being Social Security numbers. So there are about 200,000 numbers that match the format of Social Security numbers. That's a high risk of identity theft.
Yeah.
As well as, of course, a lot of business email addresses, and then the context for some business relationship. So I think, for phishing campaigns, it would be very useful for that kind of attack.
Yeah. All right, great. Thanks for that. So who was affected by these data leaks?
Yeah, I mean, so there are a few of the larger ones that we mentioned in the report. There were actually a pretty high concentration of US government groups. And I think it really has to do with the need to stand up COVID vaccination websites. And there were a number of other ones that we didn't talk about, the sources of them, because they were smaller. And sort of the point was made. But there were a lot of COVID vaccination sites being stood up. And I think it's because people needed sites right now.
Yeah, so it was easy. Yeah.
Yeah, and the delays of weeks or months, would be it cost people's lives. And so it makes sense to use the product to hand that can do this. And I think that that circumstance really led to a lot more sensitive data being exposed in this way, because this was the perfect product for this urgent need. But then they're also, I mean, it's a good product for sort of a kind of CRM management. And so we would find, Microsoft customers are big companies. So large companies using it to manage, large collections of personnel or job applicant data.
Yeah.
But then also, data you need to collect a bunch of PII and then put it through some kind of like ETL process. It's a great product for that, which just also unfortunately leads to large scale, personal data being exposed for large companies.
Yeah. And what would you say was the most sensitive data that you discovered during this process?
Yeah, I mean, probably either the COVID testing data was interesting in that it didn't have a diagnosis. So it didn't say who was positive or not.
Yeah.
But as part of our process, we try to verify that data is real, that it identifies natural persons rather than being dummy data.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it was easy to identify natural persons, and then of course, like where they live. I think we didn't do any sort of like at scale, lookups of the people involved. We have no interest in violating privacy. It's just to establish, are these natural persons? But I think if that was your goal, then yeah, you'd have like a pretty good graph of people who were being tested for COVID at what location and at what time, which then starts to give you a pretty good picture of who has COVID, or or like where, in what communities it's happening. And I think it just, it's not a great time to I don't know, some like, I don't know, stigma around it. I think that's sort of a personal thing to go through.
Yeah, that's right. You wouldn't want everyone to know about whether you have COVID or not. It's not the best thing to be putting out there publicly.
Yeah. I mean, I guess you probably should tell your friends if you have COVID anyway. But
but probably not the whole world.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So I believe there was Microsoft also had an exposure. Will you be able to speak to this a little bit more?
Oh yeah, of course. So Microsoft had a bunch of portals exposed. Microsoft is huge. And so there are all these different groups within them. And then of course they need to do their own stuff. And they have all kinds of different like interfaces, that every business unit would have. So there's one for managing like a hiring process. I think it was one for managing just internal ideas. Like if you have ideas about our product, cool, here's the process to go put them in here instead of DMing them to me. And then also like developer partners. So a user community, you all use our product, you have good ideas, you have feature requests, here's a way to manage that. And then the largest one was related to their global payroll. So it was, there's 300,000 odd records. And it was just, and again, it was just for a process of people have questions about payroll. It's like, why didn't I get paid on this day? Why is it $50 less than I thought it was going to be? All those kinds of questions that you just would have, just at a huge scale, because Microsoft has so many employees around the world.
So that's interesting actually. So it's almost like their support questions and like a help desk style kind of conversation that was all public basically. Okay, so how did you guys kind of come across this, and what was Microsoft's reaction when you first told them about this issue?
Yeah, I mean, the process of working with the analyst on their side was good. They have if you want to report a vulnerability to Microsoft, they have a website set up for that. They like a good way to intake that data. And then the person was responsive. And they asked us reasonable questions. But yeah, it was fairly quickly deemed to be by design, which is, and they sent us some documentation saying that. And I said, I know.
Like, I kind of know that.
So kind of, I think, fell through the cracks of, not being a vulnerability in the sense they were prepared to receive. And so, at that point, the case was closed, and we notified affected entities. And then I think at that point that made the case like more, stronger to them that we should do something more about this.
Yeah, correct. And so how was the response of the entities that you reached out to as well? Was that also positive and a similar kind of approach and response to Microsoft?
Um, I mean, it always there are certainly some that are more defensive than others,
Yeah.
and then others that are more gracious than others. Um, yeah, so you never know. I mean, it's why we try. We usually are notifying one entity at a time, and then we can sort of handle that. It was a lot of work to communicate out to this many different orgs, and then to handle the response. In fact, like a lot of that is still ongoing
Yeah.
as yeah yeah, people I guess have realized later that they have data they want deleted.
Yeah, of course.
And I mean, it's kind of strange. Like I'm working with one group right now where we're going through the whole thing where we've delivered a replica of the data to them so they can analyze it on their side.
Yeah.
Well, then, yeah, we'll give them a written attestation saying we've deleted all the data, and delete all the data. And you know, it involves like their privacy officer, legal officer, like the whole thing. Which weird is that there are other groups with the same kinds of data who've never contacted us at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very uneven response.
Yeah, right. So we have a question from one of our listeners. So did Microsoft acknowledge that this issue had been reported to them earlier?
No, I mean, no. We, yeah, yeah, there are other, there, you know, I think we put in our report evidence of other users sort of clarifying, hey, is this really how this works? But Microsoft's like communications to us were fairly limited. I mean, it was really just us talking to the one analyst to clarify the steps to reproduce, and then giving them our IP addresses so they could correlate those with their logs. But yeah, even like when Microsoft released an update, their notification to other people, that stuff I learned about from third parties that were affected. Microsoft is not really, you know, yeah, they're not telling us about what they're doing.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. And we have another question. So what are your thoughts on, I hope I pronounce this properly, Colchester Borough Council being used as a customer success story by Microsoft while still having exposed data to this day?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess their like account rep should talk to them about that.
Yeah.
Some of them, yeah. I don't know about Colchester. I don't, yeah, sorry, I don't know about their specific case, but yeah, hopefully, I mean, yeah, I guess if they're a case study, they should have like a named account rep. And yeah, like one of the entities we notified and I talked with quite a bit was saying like, I'm going to talk to my Microsoft rep about this. And is there anything you want to tell him? And I said, well, no, I mean, I've said everything I need to say. But yeah, a lot of the customers involved here seem to have good communication inroads with Microsoft. So I think that's probably the way for them to handle that.
Yep. Okay, great. So now if we move on to thinking about some of the key learnings from this data leak, what do you think contributed to this problem occurring in the first place? Do you think it was mainly around misconfiguration?
Well, I think part of it is the sort of like incremental development of like long-lasting software products, where portals are in the Power universe are a later iteration of Microsoft CRM and Dynamics, and sort of developing this thing incrementally and adding these features until you get to a point where the interplay of features for managing OData APIs and managing table permissions lead to this issue that probably was not in the earlier generations of those products. But then also just when thinking about a feature, not just does this serve some user's business goal, which there are legitimate like business goals for having this data public, but also what's the worst thing that can happen? And
Yeah.
what happens if the person using this doesn't read the documentation and they're not what's the scenario where someone does this wrong? And then I think you want to have sort of a likelihood of that happening, and then the impact kind of analysis to get to the risk.
Yeah.
And if the potential impact is extremely high, then even if it's unlikely, then you probably want to make it not happen.
Yeah, of course. And was there anything that surprised you and the team during this search and when you first found the data leak?
Yeah, I mean, it was surprising in that, so there are lots of known methods of data leaks that that we look at scale. Open Elasticsearch databases, open Mongo databases, open storage buckets. And then those are problems that are known classes of issues, and they still occur at a large scale all the time. In this case, it was a new thing. And so just seeing that, as far as we could tell, like no one had raised this as a security issue, and there were so many portals misconfigured in this way, and then the types of data being stored in them. That was really the surprise, was not just, wow, this is one bad misconfiguration, but here's a systemic issue.
Yeah. And how would you say this data leak compares to other leaks that we've found?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think it's actually a good place to make this sort of case in point is the top level numbers are how breaches and leaks are always reported, X million records. 38 million is like a low number in the universe of leaks, but I think that's not what's really important for sort of comparing leaks, because when you find those giant databases or databases with many records, they're usually just like marketing databases. And it's like, okay, cool, here's this collection of email addresses that we just keep sort of snowballing from marketing place to marketing place, without a lot of context to make it useful, or without a lot of like information about the people's lives. In this case, I mean, the number is smaller, but the extent of effect for government cloud customers is pretty rare. Yeah. I mean, government sites certainly have issues. In fact, there was while this was going on, there was a different exposure of COVID data in Texas, just from people uploading it to the wrong web directory. But yeah, it's pretty rare to have government exposure at this scale.
Yeah. So we've got another question from the audience. Was Microsoft the customer, or was this leak found because Microsoft was a third-party vendor?
Microsoft is not a customer. It was a third-party thing.
Yeah, correct. So if we think about, some prevention techniques or prevention controls that you could put in place, what can people do to prevent exposures like this happening in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing to say is just it's tough. If no one has reported on it, then it's just tough to know to check for it. Whereas there are lots of issues that people have that are known issues, and you could be more thorough in your security assessment and catch a lot of these known issues. But for this one, then I think it just does underscore that it's worth taking the time to budget for reading documentation, taking seriously edge cases that are security concerns. There may have been someone who said, well, what if this happens? And I think maybe that's the risk associated with it, wasn't appreciated. And then also, you may be working on this and think, well, if no one's ever reported on this problem before, then it's, who am I? But I think if you think you see a security problem, then it's worth taking the time to investigate that and resolve it. Because I mean, I don't know how many people have read the documentation, but I'm sure
that's right.
in theory, it's there, it's there, and it has the answer. But just sort of recognizing that when you're seeing it is something that where I think we're usually in a mode to get things done rather than sort of dwell with it.
Yeah. And do you think, what's your opinion on, I know we touched on kind of assessing these third parties a little bit differently, but do you think it would be helpful if, when you're planning to use a product like PowerApps and, you're running through your third party risk assessment on this third party, would it be helpful to kind of think about how are we planning to use this product, and therefore what elements and what key controls should we be looking for to make sure that this is safe? And is there anything that we should be looking out for when we're designing the use of the product?
Yeah, exactly. I think starting with what data is going to go in this system can be very useful for then informing how are we going to review it. Because if we're putting just our product SKUs in, then even if it is totally breached, then the impact is lower. Whereas if the data is more sensitive, then that would be a good reason to invest more time in assessing the security, like you said.
Yeah. And what else could listeners do to protect themselves? Is there something different that individuals can do that might be using PowerApps versus companies?
I think as individuals, it's very tough. I needed a COVID test a while ago, and the urgent care site where I was signing up for it had a very low risk score from our, I use our company's plugin. And I'm looking at it and it's like, well, this IP has like several open databases, just like all this stuff. It's like a red flag. And it's like, okay, so it's like I sent them an email. It's like, I'm a security researcher. You have these issues. They'd be better. But it's just like, like as an individual, it's like they're probably like, who is this guy? If like probably a scammer. It's very difficult as an individual to have any kind of leverage there. But so I think as an individual, it's tough. But hopefully if you're watching this, listening to this, then you work in security or can influence security at your company at least, or organization, and can take the time to assess new technologies, and then also very importantly have an email address on your website to report security concerns so that it gets routed to your SOC. Rather than to other groups that may say, hey, this isn't what I'm supposed to get. This looks like a scam. And I don't know how to handle it. So that's another thing that's free and can really help you with the instant response.
So would you say that's a good point, actually, that you just mentioned, because I know for a fact, working in the third-party risk management space and assessing a lot of vendors, there's one thing that we do notice, and there isn't like a security contact or an email address that you can directly send emails to in cases like this, where you do find a leak or you find a security vulnerability. So would you say with a lot of the entities that we contacted, were there any that could have done better in terms of having that security email address available, or a way to contact, the SOC center, for example? So, and what are things that companies can do better to improve in that part of their business?
Yeah, and it's usually smaller companies that don't have, there's a couple of cases. Smaller ones will sometimes not have it because they don't have they probably outsource their IT. They don't have a security person sitting there. So some of those companies, on the other hand, will have the personal email address for their CEO or individuals, and can be very responsive. But I mean, it's really straightforward. You got to have that email address, and it needs to go to someone who. This is something that an idea in GDPR that's really good is the data protection officer. Correct. You just have someone. They don't have to be, it's a named role rather than I just do the privacy stuff. But there's a DPO at whatever, and then it goes to a person who's expecting it and has a process defined. Like you're saying, it's really an important part of the vendor assessment process is, do you have that contact? Do you have that process? And if so, then it's, it all flows pretty smoothly.
Yeah, great. All right, so let's go on to some live Q&A. So listeners, if you do have any kind of key questions or any questions at all, please use the Q&A function to send those through to us now. We do have another question from somebody who's listening. What could someone who's not a security researcher do when discovering such a breach or leaks?
Yeah, I mean, so you can, I mean, if you can find the email address, contact info, like I was saying, you can always notify a company. I mean, I would say that it's important to say that you expect no compensation for it. In fact, actually, in our report, you can see the notification email we use, because there's certain language that's really important to include to say that it's not, extortive at all. As long as you are not trying to do anything shady, it's pretty easy. You find the right person, you notify them, and the worst thing's going to happen is they're going to say, you can't talk about this publicly. Depending on what your goals are, then that may or may not align with what you want.
Yeah, that's right. So most of the time, these companies do have that security contact information on their website. And if you can't find it, then I think the next best bet would be to email some sort of help desk or support email address as well. And then that would get routed to the right people, I assume, and it would get resolved from there. All right, cool. So I guess we'll wrap up now, given the time and all the questions we've answered. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And please, check out our website and check out our breaches part of our website. We've got some great blog posts on there of past breaches and leaks that we found, including a lot of information on this Microsoft PowerApps leak that we found recently. And if you've got any other general questions, you can just email our press email address, which is on the screen now. So thank you, Greg. Thanks for all your insight. I'm sure it was helpful to everybody who's listening. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, you too, Dylan. Have a good rest of your night. I know it's the middle of the night there.
Yes, it is. It's almost 4 a.m. All right, great. Thank you, everybody.